The second memoir. On the shore so close to the sea that it could be called the wave's edge, over 20 large mountain cherry trees with dark black bark stood in a row. As the new school year began, the mountain cherry trees would bloom splendidly, their brown, sticky young leaves contrasting against the blue sea. When the petals fell like a flower storm, they would scatter into the sea, drifting and dotting the surface, only to be washed back onto the shore by the waves. That cherry-blossomed sandy beach was used as the schoolyard of a certain junior high school in the Tohoku region, where I managed to enroll despite not studying much for the entrance exams. Even the school cap badge and the buttons on the uniform had a design of cherry blossoms blooming on them. There was a relative's house near that junior high school, which was also a reason my father chose that school for me, located amidst the sea and cherry trees. I was entrusted to that house and, because it was so close to the school, I was quite a lazy student, rushing to school after hearing the morning assembly bell. Still, through my antics, I gained popularity in class day by day. It was my first time, so to speak, venturing into another town, but I felt that this new place was much more comfortable than my birthplace. I could explain this as my antics becoming more suited to me, requiring less effort to deceive others. However, more importantly, there was a significant difference in the difficulty of performing between family and strangers, between my hometown and this new place. This challenge exists for any genius, even for Jesus Christ, the Son of God. For an actor, the hardest place to perform is the theater of one's hometown, especially when all relatives are seated in the same room. Even the best actors would struggle to perform under those circumstances. However, I managed to perform. Moreover, I achieved considerable success. A trickster like me, upon entering a new place, would have no chance of failing in their performance. My fear of people writhed intensely in my chest, no less than before, but my performance was indeed free and easy. In the classroom, I would always make my classmates laugh, and teachers would lament how good the class was, saying that it was truly great, even without Ōba, while covering their mouths with their hands, chuckling. I could easily provoke even the officer assigned to us, whose voice thundered like lightning. Just as I was beginning to feel that I had completely concealed my true self, I was unexpectedly stabbed from behind. It was a boy, the weakest physically in class, with a pale face and wearing an oversized jacket that certainly seemed to be a hand-me-down from his parents, resembling a robe of Prince Shotoku. He struggled in academics and was a simpleton who always observed during gym class. I didn't even consider that I needed to be wary of such a student. That day, during gym class, that boy, I don't remember his surname, but I think his first name was Taikiki, was watching, while we practiced on the horizontal bar. I pretended to look as serious as possible, shouting "Hey!" as I leaped toward the bar, only to land like a broad jump on the sand, falling hard on my backside. It was all a planned failure. Sure enough, everyone burst into laughter, and as I got up, brushing the sand off my pants with a wry smile, Taikiki, who had come from who knows where, poked me in the back and whispered in a low voice. "On purpose. On purpose." I was shaken. I never expected someone, of all people, Taikiki, to see through my intentional failure. I felt as if the world before me was engulfed in the flames of hell in an instant, and I had to suppress the urge to scream and go mad with all my might. The days that followed were filled with my anxiety and fear. On the surface, I continued to play the sad clown, making everyone laugh, but a heavy sigh would occasionally escape me, and I felt that everything I did was being seen through by Taikiki, and that soon, he would undoubtedly spread this around. The thought of this made me break out in a cold sweat, and I found myself looking around wildly, like a madman. I wanted, if possible, to keep close to Taikiki, day and night, to monitor him so that he wouldn't let my secret slip. During that time, I made every effort to convince him that my antics were genuine and not merely an act, and I even hoped to become his closest friend. If that seemed impossible, I thought I had no choice but to pray for his death. However, I never felt a desire to kill him. Throughout my life, I often wished to be killed by someone, but I had never wanted to kill anyone. I thought that doing so would only grant happiness to a fearsome opponent. To tame him, I first wore a kind smirk, reminiscent of a fake Christian, tilted my head about 30 degrees to the left, lightly hugged his small shoulders, and sweetly invited him to come visit my lodging. But he always looked blank and remained silent. However, one day after school, during the early summer, when a sudden downpour fell and students were having trouble going home, I was fine since my house was nearby. I was about to rush outside when I suddenly spotted Taikiki standing dismally behind the shoe rack. I said, "Come on, I'll lend you an umbrella," and pulled his timid hand, running together through the downpour. When we arrived home, I asked my aunt to dry our jackets, successfully inviting Taikiki into my room on the second floor. In that house, there was a 50-something aunt, a tall daughter in her 30s with glasses who looked sickly. She had once married and then returned home, whom I called Anissa following the custom of the family, and a younger sister who seemed to have just graduated from a girls' school, named Set-chan, who was shorter and round-faced. The family consisted of just these three, and while they had some stationery and sports equipment displayed in the shop below, their main income came from the rent of several tenement houses left by the deceased husband. "My ears hurt," Taikiki said while standing. "They started hurting when I got wet in the rain." When I looked, both of his ears had terrible discharge, and pus was about to ooze out of the ear shells. "This is bad." "That must hurt," I exaggeratedly feigned surprise and said, "I'm sorry for dragging you out in the rain," using a feminine tone to kindly apologize. Then I went downstairs to get cotton and alcohol, laid Taikiki down with his head resting on my lap, and carefully cleaned his ears. Taikiki, as expected, seemed unaware that this was a hypocritical scheme and said, "You'll surely be loved by a girl," while sleeping on my lap, offering foolish flattery. However, I later came to realize that this was perhaps a terrible prophecy, something like a devil's prediction, even Taikiki himself was probably unaware of. Saying love and to be loved felt vulgar and silly, and wherever it was, even in the so-called solemn setting, if those words popped up, the gloomy sanctuary would crumble and feel like it was merely a flat surface. However, using a literary term like the anxiety of being loved, instead of the vulgar phrase to be loved, didn't seem to destroy the gloomy sanctuary, which I found peculiar. When Taikiki had me deal with the pus from his ears and said that foolish flattery about being loved, I only smiled, blushing, without answering. Yet, in truth, I faintly felt something. However, writing that I thought about it due to such a coarse atmosphere created by the vulgar word to be loved would seem foolish, almost like something from a young gentleman in a comic story, and certainly, I didn't have such a silly, vulgar feeling that led me to say I thought about it. To me, women are several times more incomprehensible than men. In my family, there are more women than men, and among my relatives, there are many girls as well, including the maid from that crime story. It is not an exaggeration to say that I grew up playing only with girls since my childhood. However, it has been a real experience of walking on thin ice while associating with those women. I have almost no idea what is going on. It feels like wandering in a thick fog, and occasionally I make mistakes that are like stepping on a tiger's tail, suffering severe injuries. Unlike the beatings I receive from men, these wounds fester like internal bruises, causing extreme discomfort and are quite difficult to heal. Women attract and then push away, they belittle themselves in public and are callous, yet when no one is around, they hold tightly. Women seem to live to sleep as if they sleep deeply like the dead. I have gained various observations about women since childhood. Although they are of the same human race, they feel entirely different from men. Moreover, this incomprehensible and unpredictable being strangely pays attention to me. Words like being loved or being liked do not quite fit my situation. It might be more accurate to say being fussed over. Women seem to relax even more than men when it comes to being clowns. While I would perform for laughs, men cannot laugh endlessly. I also know that if I overdo my clowning around men, I would fail, so I always try to know when to wrap it up appropriately. However, women do not understand moderation. They keep demanding that I entertain them, and I exhaust myself responding to their endless encores. They laugh a lot. Generally, it seems that women can indulge in pleasure more than men. The daughters of the family that took care of me during my middle school years would come to my room on the second floor whenever they had free time. Each time, I would be startled and frightened. "Are you studying?" "No." I would smile and close my book, and then they would start talking about trivial things, like a geography teacher named Kanbu at school. "Hey, Ha-chan, put on some glasses." One night, my younger sister, Set-chan, came to my room to play with Anissa and insisted on making me act like a clown. "Why?" "Just do it. Borrow Anissa's glasses." She always spoke in such a rough, commanding tone. The clown obediently put on Anissa's glasses, and at once, both girls burst out laughing. Just like him. Exactly like Lloyd. At that time, a foreign comedian named Harold Lloyd was very popular in Japan. I stood up and raised one hand, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen," and attempted a speech to the fans in Japan, making them laugh even more. Every time Lloyd's movie came to our town's theater, I would secretly go and study his expressions. One autumn night, while I was reading in bed, Anissa swiftly entered the room like a bird and suddenly collapsed on my futon, crying, "You're going to help me, right, Ha-chan? We should leave this house together. Help me, please." She babbled in an intense manner and continued to cry. However, since this was not the first time I had seen such behavior from a woman, I was not particularly surprised by Anissa's extreme words. Instead, I felt a sense of boredom at their banality and meaninglessness. I quietly got out from under the futon, peeled a persimmon on the desk, and handed a piece to Anissa. She ate the persimmon while sobbing. "Do you have any interesting books? Lend me one." I chose Soseki's "I Am a Cat" from the bookshelf for her. "Thank you for the treat," Anissa said with an embarrassed smile as she left the room. However, not just with Anissa, but in general, thinking about how women live their lives feels more complicated, troublesome, and creepy to me than trying to understand the thoughts of an earthworm. I did know from childhood experiences that if a woman suddenly cries like that, giving her something sweet would cheer her up. Moreover, my younger sister, Set-chan, would bring her friends to my room, where I would fairly entertain them all, and after her friends left, Set-chan would always speak ill of them. She would say, "That girl is bad news, so be careful." If that was the case, it would have been better not to bring them over at all. As a result, most of my visitors ended up being women. However, this was never the realization of Teikiki's flattering remark about being loved. In other words, I was merely the Harold Lloyd of Japan's Tohoku region. Teikiki's foolish flattery became a dreadful prophecy, living on vividly and taking on an ominous form years later. Teikiki had also given me another significant gift. It's a ghost painting. he proudly explained one day when he came to visit me on the second floor, showing me a brightly colored print he had brought with him. Oh, I thought. At that moment, it felt as if my path was determined, a feeling that would linger in later years. I knew it was merely a self-portrait by Van Gogh. In our youth, French Impressionist paintings had become incredibly popular in Japan, and most of us, including country middle school students, knew about the works of artists like Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Léger from photographs. I had seen a considerable number of Van Gogh's color prints and found the touch in vivid colors interesting, but I had never thought of them as ghost paintings. Well, how about this one? Is it still a ghost? I took out a book of Modigliani's paintings from the bookshelf and showed him a statue of a nude woman with a skin tone like burnt bronze. Wow! Teikiki's eyes widened in admiration. It looks like a horse from hell. Is it still a ghost? I want to paint ghost paintings like this. People who are too terrified of humanity tend to wish even more to see more terrifying monsters with their own eyes. Nervous and easily frightened people pray for even stronger storms. Ah, this group of artists has been tormented and threatened by the monster of humanity, and finally, they came to believe in illusions, seeing ghosts clearly in the light of day. Moreover, they made no effort to disguise it with clowns but strived for a genuine expression of what they saw. Just as Teikiki said, they boldly painted ghost paintings. In that, I felt a sense of kinship with my future self, and I was so excited that I could have cried. I'll paint too. I'll paint ghost paintings. I'll paint horses from hell. I said to Teikiki in a surprisingly hushed voice. I had loved drawing and viewing art since elementary school. However, the reputation of my drawings was not as good as my writing. I had never trusted human language at all, so writing was just a kind of foolish greeting to me, and while I delighted my teachers throughout elementary and middle school, I found no real joy in it. Only in drawing, except for cartoons, did I put in some effort, albeit in my childish style, to express the subject. The model paintings in school were boring, and the teachers' drawings were poorly done. I had to invent various expressive methods entirely at random. When I entered middle school, I had a complete set of oil painting supplies, but when I sought touch models in the Impressionist style, my paintings ended up looking flat like traditional Japanese paper crafts, and I thought they would not amount to anything. However, thanks to Teikiki's words, I realized that my mindset toward painting until then had been entirely wrong. The sweetness and foolishness of trying to express something beautiful as it is felt. The masters create beauty out of the mundane according to their subjectivity, and while they may feel disgust at something ugly, they do not hide their interest and revel in the joy of expression. This primitive guide to painting, which seemed to indicate they were not at all dependent on others' expectations, was given to me by Teikiki. I kept it hidden from the women visitors and gradually began working on a self-portrait. I was startled to find I had created a rather grim painting. However, this was the true essence I had buried deep within my heart. Though outwardly cheerful and making others laugh, I indeed harbored such a gloomy heart. I quietly accepted this as inevitable, yet I could not show that painting to anyone other than Teikiki. I feared being exposed as a clown hiding a grim bottom and also worried that it might be perceived as merely a new kind of foolishness, becoming a source of great laughter, which would be the most painful thing of all. So I immediately tucked that painting deep into the closet. In art class at school, I kept my ghost painting technique hidden and painted in the same ordinary touch as before, trying to depict beautiful things beautifully. I had shown Teikiki my easily wounded nerves without reservation. I confidently showed him this self-portrait, which he praised highly, and continued to paint 2 or 3 more ghost paintings. From Teikiki, I received another prophecy. You're going to become a great painter. The prophecy of being loved and the prophecy of becoming a great painter were inscribed on my forehead by the foolish Taikiki, and eventually, I came to Tokyo. I wanted to enter an art school, but my father had already decided to put me in high school with the intention of making me a government official, and he had communicated this to me, so being the kind of person who couldn't argue back, I resigned myself to it. I was told to take the entrance exam for the 4th year, and since I was quite fed up with my middle school in Sakura and Umi, I didn't progress to the 5th year, graduated from the 4th year, and took the entrance exam for a high school in Tokyo, passing it right away. However, I was soon disheartened by the filth and brutality of dormitory life, and it was no longer a joke. I had a doctor write a certificate diagnosing pulmonary infiltration and moved out of the dormitory to my father's villa in Ueno Sakuragi town. I simply could not adapt to communal living. Moreover, words like the thrill of youth or the pride of young people sent chills down my spine, and I simply couldn't keep up with the so-called high school spirit. The classrooms and the dormitory felt like a cesspool of distorted sexual desires, and my near-perfect clowning around proved to be of no use there. Since my father stayed in the house only 1 or 2 weeks a month when the assembly was not in session, during his absence, I was left alone in that quite large house with just the elderly couple taking care of the villa and myself. I often skipped school and had no motivation to go sightseeing in Tokyo. In fact, I would probably finish without ever seeing Meiji Shrine, the bronze statue of Kusunoki Moshige, or the grave of the 47 Ronin at Sengakuji Temple. Instead, I spent my days at home reading books and painting. When my father came to Tokyo, I hurried to school every morning, but there were also times when I would go to the Western painter Shintaro Yasuda's art studio in Bunkyo Sendagi and practice drawing for 3 or 4 hours. After leaving the high school dormitory, even when I attended classes, I felt like I was in a special position, almost like an auditor. It might have been my envy, but I began to feel increasingly alienated, which made me reluctant to go to school. Throughout elementary, middle, and high school, I ultimately never understood school spirit. I never even attempted to learn the school anthem. Eventually, at the art studio, I learned about alcohol, cigarettes, prostitutes, pawnshops, and leftist ideologies from a certain art student. It was a strange combination, but it was true. This art student, Masao Hiraiki, was born in downtown Tokyo, 6 years older than me, graduated from a private art school, and since he didn't have a studio at home, he continued his studies in Western painting at this studio. "Can you lend me 5 yen?" We had only known each other by sight until then, without having exchanged a single word. I hesitated but handed over the 5 yen. "All right, let's drink. I'll treat you. You're a good guy." I couldn't refuse, and he dragged me to a cafe near the studio in Horai town, which marked the beginning of our friendship. "I've had my eye on you for a while. That bashful smile of yours is a characteristic expression of a promising artist. Here's to our acquaintance. Kainu-san, isn't he a handsome guy? Don't fall in love with him. Thanks to him coming to the studio, I'm unfortunately now the second handsome guy." Hiraiki had a dark complexion and a well-proportioned face, and he was unusually well dressed for an art student, wearing a proper suit with a modest tie, and his hair was neatly parted with pomade. Being in an unfamiliar place, I awkwardly fidgeted, folding and unfolding my arms, offering nothing but bashful smiles. However, as I drank 2 or 3 beers, I began to feel a strange sense of liberation. I was thinking of entering an art school, but no, that's boring. Such places are dull. Schools are boring. Our teachers are in nature. Our pathos is toward nature. However, I felt no respect for what he was saying. I thought he was a foolish person, and surely his art skills were lacking, but I considered him a good partner for fun. In other words, at that moment, I was seeing a genuine urban fool for the first time. Although he differed in form from me, he was undoubtedly similar in being completely disconnected from human endeavors in this world and wandering in confusion. He acted without being aware of his clowning, and that was the essence of his being, which set him apart from me. I always looked down on him for merely wanting to play, and at times felt embarrassed about my friendship with him, yet as I walked alongside him, I ultimately found myself overpowered by this man. Initially, I thought of him as a good person, a rare and admirable individual, and even I, with my fear of people, let my guard down, thinking I had found a great guide in Tokyo. In reality, I was terrified of the conductor when riding the train alone, fearful of the young women standing on either side of the stairs at the entrance of the Kabukiza theater where the crimson carpets were laid, scared of the waiters silently standing behind me in restaurants, waiting for my dishes to be cleared, and especially when it came time to pay the bill. Oh, my clumsy hands! When I would make a purchase and hand over money, it wasn't because I was stingy, rather, due to overwhelming tension, embarrassment, anxiety, and fear, I would feel dizzy and the world would go dark. I would almost feel half crazed, often forgetting not only to receive my change but even to take the items I had bought home, which meant I couldn't walk around Tokyo alone. Consequently, I often spent entire days lounging at home. However, when I handed my wallet to Hiraiki and walked together, he expertly haggled over prices and was so good at enjoying himself that he demonstrated how to maximize the impact of a small amount of money when paying. He also avoided expensive taxis and used various means of transportation, like trains, buses, and steamers, effectively arriving at our destinations in the shortest time possible. On the way home from the brothel in the morning, he taught me that it was luxurious yet inexpensive to stop by a certain ryote for a morning bath and have a light drink with udofu, boiled tofu. He also extolled the virtues of the cheap yet nutritious offerings of food stalls, guaranteed that nothing could rival the quick intoxication of electric brandy, and above all, he never made me feel a single ounce of anxiety or fear about the costs. Furthermore, associating with Hiraiki saved me because he completely ignored the listener's intentions and continued to engage in meaningless chatter, letting his so-called passion flow freely, though perhaps passion might involve ignoring the other person's position. There was absolutely no fear of falling into that awkward silence that often comes after we walked together and grew tired. In my anxiety about interacting with people, I had previously struggled to break the silence, but now, with this fool Hiraiki unconsciously taking on the role of the entertainer, I could simply listen without much response, occasionally laughing at his outlandish remarks. I eventually came to realize that alcohol, tobacco, and prostitutes were quite effective means of temporarily alleviating my fear of people. I even developed a mindset in which I would not hesitate to sell all my possessions to seek those means. To me, prostitutes appeared neither human nor female, more like idiots or madmen, and within their embrace, I felt entirely secure and could sleep soundly. They were so tragically devoid of desire. I sensed a kind of affinity with them, and they always showed me a degree of natural kindness that was not constricted or forced, a goodwill towards someone who might never return. I even experienced nights where I witnessed the reality of Mary's allure in those idiot-like or mad prostitutes. However, as I sought to escape my fear of humanity and find a faint respite for one night, I began to unconsciously carry an unspeakable atmosphere around me, which I had never intended, the so-called bonus edition. Gradually, this edition became more pronounced, and when Hiraiki pointed it out, I was taken aback and felt quite uncomfortable. To an outsider, and in crass terms, I seemed to be honing my skills with women through my interactions with prostitutes, and it was said that this training was the most rigorous and thus the most effective. I had already begun to attract a sense of being an experienced man with women, and women, not just prostitutes, seemed to instinctively sniff it out and gravitate towards me. This lewd and dishonorable atmosphere, even as a bonus addition, appeared to overshadow my attempts at rest. Hiroki likely said that partly in jest, but I could not help but feel the weight of his words. For instance, I recalled receiving a clumsy letter from a cafe waitress, and how the daughter of the general next door to my house would casually come out in light makeup every morning as I left for school, seemingly without reason. When I went out for beef, even if I remained silent, the waitresses there would engage with me. Additionally, there were times when the daughter of the tobacco shop I frequented handed me cigarettes. Or when I went to see kabuki, the person next to me would. Or when I was drunk and sleeping on the late-night streetcar. I also unexpectedly received a letter from a relative's daughter in my hometown, expressing deep feelings. And once, a girl I didn't recognize left a handmade doll while I was out. I was so exceedingly passive that all these interactions led nowhere, remaining merely fragments without further development. However, it was undeniable that some atmosphere of making women dream lingered around me. It was not just a light-hearted joke but an undeniable truth. When Hiroki pointed this out, I felt a humiliation that resembled suffering, and suddenly lost interest in spending time with prostitutes. Horiguchi, with his superficial modernity, I still cannot think of any other reason in his case, one day took me to a secret study group known as a communist reading group. I think it was called RS, but my memory isn't clear. For someone like Horiguchi, a secret communist meeting may have been no more than one of those Tokyo guides. I was introduced to the so-called comrades, forced to buy a pamphlet, and then I attended a lecture on Marxian economics from a horribly ugly young man in a place of honor. However, to me, it seemed like something that was already understood. It was probably true, but there were more incomprehensible and terrifying things in the human heart. Even if I said desire, it felt insufficient. If I said vanity, that felt inadequate too. Even if I mentioned both lust and desire, it still didn't capture it. Somehow, I felt that there was something strange and ghostly lying beneath the human world, something beyond mere economics, and I was terrified of that ghost story. While I naturally accepted so-called materialism as easily as water flows downward, it did not free me from the fear of humanity, nor did it allow me to open my eyes to the fresh leaves or feel the joy of hope. Nevertheless, I attended every single meeting of that RS, I think it was called that, but I may be mistaken, without fail. It was ridiculous to see the comrades engrossed in what seemed to be almost elementary arithmetic theories, with stiff faces as if it were a matter of great importance, as they pondered that 1 + 1 = 2. I tried to lighten the mood with my usual antics, and perhaps as a result, the tense atmosphere of the meetings gradually relaxed, and I became somewhat of an indispensable popular figure at those gatherings. These seemingly simple people might have thought of me as a simple, optimistic jester, just like them, but if that were the case, I had completely deceived them from beginning to end. I was not one of them. Still, I never missed a meeting and provided my comic relief to everyone. It was because I liked them. I was fond of those people. However, it was not necessarily a bond of affection forged by Marxism. It was illegal. I found it faintly enjoyable. In fact, I felt quite at ease. The world of legality was even more terrifying. It seemed to hint at something unfathomably strong, and I could not sit in that windowless, bone-chilling room. Even if the outside was an illegal sea, it seemed more comfortable to dive in, swim, and eventually die. There is a term called hikagomono, literally shadowed person. It seems to refer to miserable losers or evildoers in human society. However, I felt like a hikagomono from the moment I was born, and when I met someone who was pointed out by the world as a hikagomono, I always became kind-hearted. This kind heart of mine was so tender that it left me entranced. There is also the term criminal consciousness. I have suffered from this consciousness throughout my life in this human world. However, it could be said that it was like a good companion, like a wife made of scraps, with whom I played and entertained myself in loneliness. Perhaps that was one aspect of how I lived. There is also a common saying about someone having a wounded shin, but the injury has been naturally present on one of my shins since infancy. Instead of healing as I grew older, it only deepened, reaching the bone. While I experienced nightly pain that could be described as a hell of 1,000 transformations, this is a rather strange way of putting it. That wound gradually became more familiar to me than my own flesh and blood. The pain of that wound felt like a living emotion, or even a whisper of affection. For someone like me, the atmosphere of that underground movement group was strangely comforting and cozy. In other words, the nature of that movement suited me more than its original purpose. In Horiguchi's case, he merely made a fool of himself and went to introduce me to that meeting just once. The Marxists would say something silly like, in addition to studying the production side, it's also necessary to inspect the consumption side, and he would not attend the meetings. He always wanted to invite me to the inspection of the consumption side. Looking back, there were various types of Marxists at that time. Some, like Horiguchi, self-identified as such out of a vanity for modernity, while others, like myself, simply liked the smell of illegality and had there. If these realities were seen through by true devotees of Marxism, both Horiguchi and I would have been driven away as despicable traitors in a blaze of anger. However, neither I nor even Horiguchi faced expulsion from the group. Particularly for me, within that illegal world, I could behave more freely and healthily than I could in the world of legal gentlemen. As a result, I became somewhat of a promising comrade, inundated with absurdly secretive requests that made me want to burst out laughing. Moreover, in fact, I never once turned down any such requests, accepting everything without hesitation. I never faced any suspicion or interrogation from the police, whom the comrades referred to as dogs, and I managed to carry out the so-called dangerous work they entrusted me with, all while smiling and making others laugh. Although the people involved in that movement were extremely tense as if it were a matter of utmost importance and even went so far as to mimic bad detective stories, using utmost caution, the jobs they asked me to do were shockingly trivial. Nevertheless, they were incredibly earnest about their requests. At that time, I felt that even if I were to be captured as a party member and spent the rest of my life in prison, I would be fine with it. I thought that perhaps it would be easier than moaning in a nightly hell of insomnia, terrified of the real lives of people in this world. My father, at the villa in Sakurgicho, was so busy with visitors and outings that, even when we were in the same house, I could go days without seeing his face. However, I found him suffocating and frightening, and I was thinking about leaving this house for a boarding house, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Just then, I heard from the old caretaker that my father seemed to be planning to sell the house. My father's term as a counselor was coming to an end, and there were probably various reasons for this, but he seemed to have no intention of running for election again. Moreover, he had built a retirement home in his hometown, showing no lingering attachment to Tokyo. Perhaps he thought it was a waste to provide a residence and servants for someone like me, merely a high school student. I could never fully understand my father's feelings, which were much like those of others in society. In any case, the house would soon be sold, and I moved to a dim room in an old boarding house called Sinayukan in Ongo Morikawa-cho, and before long, I found myself in financial trouble. Until then, my father had given me a fixed monthly allowance, which would often run out within 2 or 3 days. However, I always had tobacco, alcohol, cheese, and fruit available at home, and I could always buy books, stationery, and clothing on credit from nearby shops. Even when I treated haraiki to soba or tempura, I didn't have to worry as long as it was from one of my father's favorite local shops. Suddenly living alone in a boarding house, I had to make do with a fixed monthly remittance, and I was at a loss. The remittance would disappear within 2 or 3 days, and I became terrified and anxious, even to the point of going crazy. I sent telegrams and letters to my father, brother, and sister, alternating my requests for money. The circumstances I described in those letters were completely fabricated for comedic effect. I believed it was best to make someone laugh when asking for help, and, following Haraiki's advice, I eagerly began to visit pawnshops, but I was always short of money. After all, I had no ability to live alone in a boarding house to which I had no connections. I found it terrifying to be alone in that room, fearing that someone would suddenly attack me. I would run out into the streets to help with the movement, or drink cheap alcohol with haraiki, nearly abandoning my studies and my painting. By November of my second year of high school, I became involved in a scandalous love affair with an older married woman, completely altering my circumstances. I was missing school and had done no studying, yet I strangely found that I could manage to perform well on exams. Up until then, I had been able to deceive my relatives back home, but it seemed that soon enough the school was secretly reporting my absences to my father, who began sending long, stern letters to me through my older brother, acting as his proxy. However, my most immediate suffering came from the lack of money, and the tasks for the movement were becoming so demanding that they could no longer be treated lightly. I had become the head of the Marxist student action teams in all the schools around Ongo, Koishikawa, Shitaya, Kanda, and the surrounding areas. Hearing about an armed uprising, I bought a small knife. In retrospect, it was a flimsy thing, barely useful for sharpening pencils, and put it in my pocket, darting around to establish what we called contacts. I wanted to drink and sleep deeply, but I had no money. Moreover, from the P, I recall referring to the party with that code name, though I might be mistaken. I was being bombarded with urgent requests for tasks without even a moment to catch my breath. With my frail health, it seemed impossible to continue. Originally, I had helped the group out of mere interest in the illegality of it all, but as it became increasingly hectic, I couldn't help but harbor a grudging thought toward the people from P. Isn't this outside your expertise? Why not let your direct affiliates handle this? I fled. However, even after escaping, I didn't feel good about it and decided to end my life. At that time, there were 3 women who had a special fondness for me. One was the daughter of the landlord where I was staying, the Senyukin. This girl would always come to my room with a notepad and a fountain pen after I returned home exhausted from helping with the movement, often going to bed without eating. "I'm sorry. It's noisy down below with my younger siblings, so I can't write my letters in peace," she would say, and she would spend over an hour writing something at my desk. I could have just pretended to sleep, but she seemed to want me to say something. Although I really didn't want to speak, I was so tired that I pushed myself to get up, lit a cigarette, and said, "I've heard there's a guy who took a bath after receiving a love letter from a woman. Oh dear, is that you? I have drunk warmed milk before. How lovely. Drink up." I thought to myself, I wish she would just go home. It's so transparent that she's just here to write a letter. She must be writing some silly nonsense. "Show it to me," I said, feeling as though I would rather die than see it. She kept saying, oh no," and her delight in that was rather embarrassing, killing my mood. So I thought I should give her an errand. Sorry, but could you go to the pharmacy on Train Street and get me some Kamodin? I'm so exhausted that my face is hot, and I can't sleep. Sorry about that. The money is. Don't worry about the money. She stood up happily. I knew that giving a woman an errand wouldn't discourage her. In fact, women often feel happy when a man asks them for something. The second was a so-called comrade from the women's high school teacher training program. I had to see her every day for the movement's work, whether I liked it or not. Even after meetings, she would follow me around and buy me things incessantly. You can think of me as your real sister, she said dramatically, and I shivered at her pretentiousness. I see you that way, I replied, forcing a smile that conveyed my sadness. I thought I had to somehow placate her because I was afraid of angering her. So I served that ugly, annoying woman, accepted the things she bought for me, which were all terribly in bad taste, and I usually just passed them on to the old man at the yakitori shop, and made her laugh with jokes. One summer night, unable to shake her off, I kissed her just to send her home in the dark part of the street. She became uncharacteristically excited, as if in a frenzy, called a car, and took me to a small, office-like room that seemed to be secretly borrowed for their movement, where we made a great ruckus until morning. I secretly chuckled at how ridiculous this sister was. With both the landlord's daughter and this comrade, I had to face them every day. Unlike my previous experiences with various women, I couldn't easily avoid them, and inevitably, out of my anxiety, I desperately tried to appease these two. I felt like I was in a straitjacket. At the same time, there were 3 women who had a special fondness for me. One was the daughter of the landlady at the boarding house where I was staying, the Senyukin. This girl would always come to my room with stationery and a fountain pen after I returned home utterly exhausted from helping with the aforementioned movement, and would say, "I'm sorry. It's too noisy down there with my younger siblings, so I can't write a letter properly." She would then spend more than an hour writing something at my desk. I could have just pretended to be asleep, but she seemed to be wanting me to say something. So, despite my desire to remain silent, I mustered up the energy to turn over, smoke a cigarette, and say, "I've heard that there are men who boil water for a bath after receiving love letters from women." "Oh dear, is that you?" "I have boiled milk to drink." "How lovely, please drink it." I thought to myself, how nice it would be if she would leave soon, as it was obvious she was just trying to get my attention. She was probably just writing silly things, anyway. "Show me what you wrote," I said, with a strong desire not to see it, but she responded with oh no, and her excessive glee was quite embarrassing, killing the mood entirely. So I thought I should give her some task to do. "I'm sorry, but could you go to the pharmacy on the Train Street and buy some Kamodin? I'm so exhausted that my face is burning, and I can't sleep. I'm sorry. The money is." "Don't worry about the money." She stood up joyfully. I knew well that asking a woman for help does not usually discourage her. In fact, women often feel happy when a man asks them for something. The second was a so-called comrade from the women's high school normal school. I had to see this woman every day due to the aforementioned movement, whether I liked it or not. After our meetings, she would keep following me around, buying me all sorts of things. You can think of me as your real older sister. I shuddered at her pretentiousness and replied, "I do think of you that way," while forcing a smile filled with sadness. I was determined not to provoke her anger, so I had to find a way to appease her. I served this unattractive and unpleasant woman, allowing her to buy me things. The items she bought were all quite distasteful, and I usually ended up giving them away to the old man at the yakitori place, putting on a happy face and making jokes to make her laugh. One summer night, unable to get away from her, I kissed her just to make her go home. To my surprise, she became frenzied with excitement, called a car, and took me to a cramped Western-style room in a building that seemed to be secretly rented for their movement, where we made a commotion until morning. I secretly smiled wryly at the absurdity of it all. Having to see the daughter of the boarding house and this comrade every day meant that I could not avoid them as I had with the various other women in the past. As a result, I found myself desperately trying to keep these two women in good spirits, becoming increasingly ensnared in a state of financial bondage. Around the same time, I unexpectedly received a favor from a waitress at a large cafe in Ginza. Although I had only met her once, I felt a profound sense of concern and fear that made me feel trapped. By this time, I had become somewhat bold and could ride the train and go to the kabukiza on my own, and even wear a kasuri kimono and enter a cafe, although I was still deeply troubled and afraid of human confidence and violence. Outwardly, I gradually managed to greet others with a serious face. However, I still couldn't greet anyone without a painful smile of defeat. Perhaps it was because I had been running around with the movement or because of the women or the alcohol, but I was learning some skill due to the constant financial strain. I thought that if I could somehow blend in with the many drunken patrons or waitresses at the large cafe, perhaps my perpetually hunted heart would find some peace. With 10 yen in hand, I entered that large cafe in Ginza alone and smiled at the waitress, saying, "I only have 10 yen, so please keep that in mind." "Don't worry," she said, her Kansai dialect adding a unique flavor to her words. That single sentence oddly calmed my trembling heart. It wasn't that I no longer worried about money, it was more that I felt safe being near her. I drank alcohol, feeling at ease with her, and as a result, I didn't feel like putting on a facade and it instead showed my quiet, grim side, sipping my drink in silence. "Do you like this?" She laid out various dishes in front of me. I shook my head. "Just alcohol? Let's drink together." It was a cold autumn night. Following what she told me, I ate sushi at a certain stall behind Ginza, where the sushi was hardly delicious. Even though I forgot her name, I distinctly remember how bad that sushi was. Somehow, I can vividly recall the round-headed man who resembled a blue-striped snake, shaking his head as he pretended to be skillful while making sushi. I was waiting for her. She had rented a room on the second floor of a carpenter's house in Honjo. In that room, I didn't hide my usual gloomy mood and sat with my hand pressed against my cheek as if I were in terrible pain, drinking tea. To my surprise, she seemed to like my dismal appearance. She also had a cold wind blowing around her, feeling completely isolated amidst the swirling fallen leaves. As we rested together, she told me that she was 2 years older than me, from Hiroshima, that she had a husband who was a barber in Hiroshima, and that she ran away to Tokyo with him last spring. But her husband had been arrested for fraud without securing a proper job in Tokyo and was in prison. She mentioned that she used to visit him every day to bring him something, but she planned to stop going from tomorrow. However, for some reason, I had no interest in her story. Perhaps it was because she told it poorly or because she was focusing on the wrong parts of her tale, but whatever the reason, I always listened as if it went in one ear and out the other. It's a sense of desolation. I find it strange and puzzling that, despite my expectation that I would be more drawn to a single word of muttering rather than the countless tales of a woman's experiences, I have never once heard such words from any woman in this world. However, she did not verbally express desolation. Instead, she carried a terrible sense of emptiness around her, like a current of air about an inch wide. When I leaned against her, my body was enveloped in that current, blending well with my own somewhat prickly, gloomy aura. Just like a dried leaf settling on a rock at the bottom of the water, I could free myself from both fear and anxiety. The feeling of securely sleeping among the arms of those idiotic prostitutes was entirely different. For one, those prostitutes were cheerful. The night spent with the wife of that criminal was a liberating night for me, one I boldly affirm without any hesitation to use such a grand word. I intend to never again use such grand words in this entire narrative. However, it was just one night. When I woke up in the morning, I had returned to my superficial, clownish self. Cowards even fear happiness. They get hurt by cotton. Sometimes, they can be hurt by happiness. Before being hurt, they hurriedly wish to part ways, setting up a smokescreen of frivolity. The saying "when the money runs out, the bond breaks" is interpreted the wrong way. It doesn't mean that when money runs out, women will turn away. When a man runs out of money, he naturally becomes discouraged and loses his vitality, his laughter lacking strength. Eventually, he grows frustrated and, in a half-mad state, he ends up pushing women away, swinging wildly. According to the Kanazawa dictionary, poor thing. I understand that feeling too. I have a faint memory of saying something so foolish that it made Tsuneko burst out laughing. It was unnecessary to stay long, and feeling apprehensive, I quickly left without even washing my face. Yet, my absurd remark about "when the money runs out, the bond breaks" unexpectedly became a sticking point later on. After that, I did not meet my benefactor from that night for a month. As days went by after parting, the joy faded, and receiving such temporary kindness became frightening instead. I began to feel a terrible bondage over my selfish actions, even starting to worry about how I had made Tsuneko bear the entire bill at the cafe. Tsuneko began to seem just like the landlady's daughter or the female student from the high school, merely a woman who would threaten me. Even from afar, I was constantly fearful of Tsuneko, and on top of that, I was greatly averse to meeting a woman I had once spent time with, fearing that she might suddenly explode in anger upon our reunion. This tendency to avoid her made me increasingly steer clear of Ginza. However, this aversion was not due to my cunning. It was because I still hadn't fully grasped the peculiar phenomenon that women can live without maintaining even a speck of connection between the time they rest and when they wake up, severing two worlds completely as if it were total oblivion. At the end of November, I was drinking cheap sake with Hiraiki at a food stall in Kanda. This bad friend insisted on drinking somewhere else even after we left the stall, despite the fact that we had no money left. Nevertheless, he kept saying, "Let's drink, let's drink." At that moment, perhaps emboldened by alcohol, I said, "Okay, then I'll take you to the land of dreams. Don't be surprised, it's a place of wine pools and meat forests." "Is it a cafe?" "Yeah. Let's go." Thus, we hopped on a streetcar, and Hiraiki, excited, declared, "I'm starving for women tonight. Can I kiss a waitress?" I didn't really enjoy Hiraiki acting like that when he was drunk. He knew this, which is why he emphasized it to me. "Listen, I'm going to kiss her. I'm definitely going to kiss the waitress sitting next to me, alright? I don't care. Thanks. I'm really starving for women." We got off at Ginza 4 and entered the so-called Grand Café, almost broke, with Tsuneko as our last lifeline. The moment I sat down across from Hiraiki in an empty booth, Tsuneko and another waitress rushed over, and the other waitress sat down next to me while Tsuneko plopped down beside Hiraiki. I was taken aback. Tsuneko was about to be kissed. I didn't feel regretful. I've always had a weak sense of possession, and even if I occasionally felt a faint sense of loss, I didn't have the energy to assert ownership and compete with others over it. In fact, I had even once quietly watched my common-law wife being violated. I wanted to avoid human entanglements as much as possible. I was terrified of getting caught up in that vortex. Tsuneko and I had a one-night relationship, she wasn't mine. There was no way I could feel the desire of loss. However, I was suddenly struck by a thought. I felt pity for Tsuneko, who was receiving Hiraiki's ferocious kiss right in front of my eyes. Tsuneko, defiled by Hiraiki, would have to part ways with me, and besides, I had no positive passion to hold on to her. Ah, this is it. I was suddenly struck by Tsuneko's misfortune, but I soon gave up easily, like water flowing away, and I glanced back and forth between Hiraiki and Tsuneko, smiling wryly. However, the situation unexpectedly developed into something worse. "Stop," Hiraiki said, grimacing, "even I can't deal with such a shabby woman." He folded his arms and stared at Tsuneko, smirking. "Get us some drinks. We've got no money," I said to Tsuneko in a low voice. I really felt like drinking until I was soaked. From the viewpoint of a so-called materialist, Tsuneko was a shabby, impoverished woman, unworthy even of a drunkard's kiss. It struck me like a bolt of lightning. I drank more than I ever had before and became dizzy, gazing at Tsuneko. We exchanged pitiful smiles, and as I reflected that she was just a strangely tired and shabby woman, a sense of affinity among the monoliths began to rise within me. I now think that the discord between rich and poor, though it seems trivial, is one of the eternal themes of drama. That sense of affinity welled up in my heart, and for the first time since I was born, I consciously felt a faint, yet genuine, stir of love for Tsuneko. I vomited. It was the first time I had gotten so drunk that I lost all sense of myself. When I woke up, Tsuneko was sitting beside my pillow. I was sleeping in the second-floor room of a carpenter in Honjo. "You said, when money runs out, so does the relationship, and I thought you were joking, but you were serious. You haven't come to see me. What a complicated separation. Even if I earn money for you, it won't help, will it?" "No, it won't." Then, the woman rested, and at dawn, for the first time, the word death came out of her mouth. She seemed utterly exhausted from the struggles of being human, and I, too, overwhelmed by the fear, frustration, money, the usual burdens, women, studies, thinking of all of it, I realized I could hardly continue to live on, and I readily agreed to her suggestion. However, at that moment, I still hadn't truly resolved to die. There was still a hint of play hidden somewhere. That morning, the two of us wandered around the 6th district of Asakusa. We entered a cafe and drank milk. "Please, pay for me." As I stood up, I took my purse out from my sleeve, and when I opened it, 3 coins rolled out. Rather than feeling shame, I was struck by a sense of horrific despair. Instantly, the image that floated in my mind was my room at Senyuken, where only my uniform and futon remained, with nothing else left but a desolate space that seemed destined to be pawned. Other than the kasuri kimono and the cloak I was wearing, this was my reality. I couldn't live. I clearly realized this. Because I hesitated, the woman also stood up and peeked into my purse. "Oh, is that all?" Her tone was innocent, but it hurt deeply, almost piercing through my bones. For the first time, I felt pain from the voice of the person I loved. 3 coins, this paltry amount wasn't even money. It was a strange humiliation I had never experienced before. It felt like I couldn't live with such humiliation. After all, at that time, I hadn't completely broken free from being a rich man's son. At that moment, I resolved to seek death, even if it meant taking the initiative. That night, we jumped into the sea in Kamakura. The woman said, "This obi is borrowed from a friend at the shop," and unfastened her obi, folding it and placing it on a rock. I also took off my mantle and placed it in the same spot, then we both entered the water together. The woman drowned. Only I was saved. Since I was a high school student and had some degree of what is called news value due to my father's name, it seemed that the incident was reported as quite a significant issue in the newspapers. I was taken to a seaside hospital, where a relative from my hometown rushed to my side to take care of various matters. They warned me that my family, starting with my father, was furious and that this might lead to a complete severing of ties with my family. However, rather than worrying about that, I was simply mournful for the deceased Tsuneko, crying endlessly. Truly, among all the people I had known, it was only that poor Tsuneko whom I had loved. I received a long letter from the daughter at the boarding house, containing 50 tanka poems, all starting with strange phrases like "Please live." In my hospital room, cheerful nurses came to visit, some even playfully gripping my hand before leaving. At that hospital, they discovered a defect in my left lung, which turned out to be very convenient for me. Eventually, I was taken from the hospital to the police station under the charge of aiding and abetting suicide. However, at the police, they treated me as a patient and placed me in a protective room. In the middle of the night, an elderly officer on night duty next door quietly opened the connecting door and called out to me. "Hey! It must be cold for you. Come over here and warm up." I deliberately walked into the duty room, looking downcast, and sat down to warm myself by the hibachi. "You still miss the dead woman, don't you?" "Yes," I replied in a particularly faint voice. "That's just human nature," he said, gradually assuming a more relaxed demeanor. "Where did you first establish a relationship with that woman?" he asked with an air of gravitas, almost like a judge. He seemed to look down on me as a child, and it was as if he were trying to extract some lascivious reminiscence from me, pretending to be the lead investigator. I quickly sensed this and struggled to suppress the urge to burst out laughing. I knew I could refuse to answer such an officer's informal questioning, but to add some interest to the autumn night, I maintained a solemn demeanor, as if to firmly believe that this officer was indeed the head investigator and that the severity of any punishment would depend entirely on his whims. I offered some vague statements to somewhat satisfy his prurient curiosity. "Yeah, I understand it pretty well now. If you answer everything honestly, we'll be lenient on our end." "Thank you very much. I appreciate it." It was nearly a divine performance on my part. For me, however, it was not particularly beneficial or significant. As dawn broke, I was summoned by the chief of police. This time, it was a formal interrogation. The moment I opened the door and stepped into the chief's office, he said, "Oh, what a handsome boy. You're not at fault here. It's your mother's fault for bringing you into this world as such a handsome boy." He was a young chief with a dark complexion, looking as if he had graduated from university. Being told that suddenly, I felt miserable, as if I had some ugly scar or deformity on half of my face. The chief's interrogation was remarkably straightforward, a stark contrast to that persistent and obsessive nocturnal officer's interrogation. Once the questioning was over, as he filled out the documents to send to the prosecutor's office, he said, "You need to keep your body healthy. It seems you've been coughing up blood." That morning, I had a strange cough, and each time I coughed, I covered my mouth with a handkerchief, which was stained with blood, as if red hail had fallen on it. However, it wasn't blood that came from my throat, it was blood from a small bump I had fiddled with under my ear last night. But for some reason, I felt it would be more convenient not to explain this, so I simply said, "Yes," looked down, and answered humbly, The chief, after finishing the paperwork, said, "Whether or not you'll be prosecuted is up to the prosecutor, but you should probably contact your guarantor by telegram or phone and ask them to come to the Yokohama prosecutor's office today. Surely you have someone, like a guardian or a surety." I remembered a man named Shibuda, a bulky bachelor in his 40s from the same hometown who was a dealer in calligraphy and antiques and frequently visited my father's villa in Tokyo. He had acted somewhat like my father's sycophant. My father always referred to him as Flatfish because he thought his eyes resembled those of a flounder, and I had grown accustomed to calling him that too. I borrowed the police telephone directory, searched for Flatfish's number, found it, and called him, asking him to come to the Yokohama prosecutor's office. To my surprise, he responded in a pompous tone, as if he had become a different person, but he agreed to take responsibility nonetheless. "Hey, you should disinfect that telephone immediately. After all, you've been coughing up blood," I heard the chief's loud voice ordering the officers as I was taken back to the protection room. In the early afternoon, I was tied up with thin hemp rope, which I was allowed to cover with a cloak. A young officer firmly held the end of the rope, and we both took the train to Yokohama. However, I felt no anxiety at all. I even felt nostalgic about the police protection room and the old officer. Ah, why am I like this? When bound as a criminal, I felt strangely relieved and relaxed. Even now, as I write about those memories, I feel genuinely carefree and happy. However, among the nostalgic memories of that time, there was one unforgettable and truly tragic blunder that made me break out in a cold sweat. I received a simple interrogation from the prosecutor in a dim room at the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor was a quiet man in his 40s. If I had been beautiful, it would have been the beauty of immorality, but the prosecutor's face had an air of calm intelligence, almost as if to say it was the beauty of righteousness. He seemed to be a person who didn't fuss, so I was completely unguarded and absent-mindedly made my statement. Suddenly, I was overcome by another coughing fit. I took out a handkerchief from my sleeve and, glancing at the blood, a base thought crossed my mind that perhaps this cough might be useful, and I exaggeratedly added a couple of fake coughs, covering my mouth with the handkerchief and glancing at the prosecutor's face. "At that moment," he asked, "is that true?" With a quiet smile. Cold sweat broke out. "No, even now that I recall it, I feel like I want to dance and panic. It feels like I experienced an even worse humiliation than when that idiot Taikiki poked my spine during middle school and kicked me into hell. Those two moments are recorded as my greatest failures in acting throughout my life. Sometimes I even think it would have been better to be sentenced to 10 years rather than to endure the prosecutor's calm contempt. I was granted a suspension of prosecution. However, I felt no joy, sitting on the bench in the waiting room of the prosecutor's office, feeling miserable as I waited for Flatfish to arrive. The evening sky was visible through the high window behind me, and seagulls were flying in shapes reminiscent of the character for woman.